All right, please turn to tab 8 in the witness binder, and you'll find a document pre-marked PX917. And Professor Herrera, can you identify this document?
This is a chapter from a book that I co-edited back in the 1990s. The book was on social science research relative to the question of lesbian and gay personnel in the U.S. military. And this was a chapter that I wrote, Why Tell If You're Not Asked, Self-Disclosure, Intergroup Contact, and Heterosexuals' Attitudes Towards Lesbians and Gay Men.
Thank you. Your Honor, again, I believe this is on the list that plaintiffs submitted this morning, so I believe it's already been admitted.
But if not, I assume there's no objection.
No objection.
If not, I would like to move it into evidence, yes.
Very well.
Now, please turn to page 201, and there's a heading in the second column called Sexual Orientation, Heterosexuality, and Homosexuality.
By the way, 926 was not offered, I believe.
I believe 926 was admitted a previous day.
Ah,
And if it was not, I would like to move it into evidence.
not with this witness.
Not with this witness, correct.
All right.
And I apologize for not clarifying that. Okay, so.
Sorry for the interruption.
No, thank you for that. All right, on the second column, you're right. Although heterosexual and homosexual behaviors alike have been common throughout human history, the ways in which cultures although heterosexual and homosexual behaviors alike have been common throughout human history, ways in which cultures have made sense of these behaviors and the rules governing them have varied widely. Is that correct?
Well, I would say that, as with all sorts of phenomena, race, ethnicity, social class, and sexuality, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. And in the United States today, human sexuality has been popularly understood in terms of the dichotomy between two types of people, those who are attracted to the same gender, homosexuals, and those who are attracted to the other gender, heterosexuals, correct?
Well, except I believe that the sentence began for at least a century in the United States and Europe.
Okay.
And then the part you read.
But do you agree that in the United States today, that's true?
Well, I would say that the dichotomy has yielded to something of a trichotomy in that bisexuals are now much more widely recognized, really, just in the last few decades than was the case before that.
All right. Thank you for that clarification. Now, this classification system differs from other possible ways of understanding sexuality in that its focus is on the individual rather than on the behavior, correct?
I'm sorry, I lost my place here.
This classification system differs from other possible ways of understanding sexuality in that its focus is on the individual rather than on the behavior, correct?
Yes.
And instead of conceiving of people as capable of a wide range of sexual attractions and behaviors, the heterosexual-homosexual dichotomy creates two ideal types that, depending on the individual, correspond more or less to actual experience and behavior, correct?
Well, again, I would say that there has been the expansion in the last few decades of a greater recognition of bisexuality being another type, if you will, that is related to sexuality.
All right, would you agree with the statement that the heterosexual, bisexual, homosexuality trichotomy creates three ideal types that, depending on the individual, corresponds more or less to actual experience and behavior?
Well, and I would point out, I'm using type here, or ideal type,
yes.
In the social science sense, which means that this is something of a construct. This is a category, and so, yes.
Okay, thank you. And by a construct or a category, that's what you mean when you say that depending on the individual, it may correspond more or less to actual experience and behavior, correct?
Well, by saying ideal type, I didn't want you to think that I was somehow saying this is how it should be, or this is the ideal we should strive for, but rather these are, there's a sort of clean, clear distinction between all individuals according to this dichotomy or trichotomy, and that's what's meant by ideal type.
Okay, thank you. Now, defining oneself personally and socially as gay or lesbian, or more recently queer, provides entry to alternative communities that have developed in the United States and elsewhere, correct?
I'm sorry, are you still reading from this? I lost where you are, if you're reading from it.
I'm not reading from the paragraph.
Okay.
I'm asking you a question.
I'm sorry, I thought you were just reading through. I'm sorry, could you...
Yes, defining oneself personally and socially as gay or lesbian, or more recently queer, provides entry into alternative communities that have developed in the United States and elsewhere, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if you would, please turn to tab 10 in the witness binder, Professor Herrera. And you'll see here in the binder select pages from a book that we have designated as DIX 2654. And I have a physical copy of this book here in this courtroom if you would like to look at that. But these are the pages that I'm going to look at. Your Honor, do I need to show him the book, or is this sufficient?
Well, why don't you let the witness make the decision?
I would, I would like to see this book because actually I don't recognize this.
All right, just a moment if you would.
Of course.
Permission to approach the witness?
Of course.
Your Honor, if we could get a copy as well.
Do you have a copy for counsel?
I don't have an extra copy. The discussion that we are going to use is all reproduced in the exhibit book.
Well, let's try a question and take it one step at a time.
Okay, thank you. Can you identify that document, Professor Herrera?
No, I can't. I've never seen it before.
Are you familiar with Professor Badgett?
I know Professor Badgett.
And she is the editor of this book, correct?
It is edited by M.V. Lee Badgett and Jefferson Frank.
And that Lee Badgett is Professor Badgett that we are speaking of, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And if you turn to page 21, it's reproduced in the binder, or you can turn in the book if you would prefer. We're in a chapter of that book that's written by Professor Badgett called Discrimination Based on Sexual Orientation, a review of the literature in economics and beyond. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And as again, you're familiar with Professor Badgett.
I am familiar with Professor Badgett. I've never read this article to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, Your Honor, I would like to offer this into evidence, Exhibit DIX 2654.
Center tab 10.
That's correct.
Why don't you ask a question?
All right.
This hasn't apparently been provided to opposing counsel before. Why don't you just...
Well, we designated this as an exhibit some time ago, and with books on both sides, we've identified the books, I believe. For copyright reasons, we have not attempted to make complete photocopies of the books and just given them as PDFs. And I believe that's true
fair
across
enough.
the boards for both sides.
Just ask a question,
Okay.
and see whether this particular book or document or excerpt to a question to the witness.
All right, we will do that. Please look at page 21. Professor Badgett writes on, it's the first full paragraph. The first complication is defining what one means by sexual orientation, or being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or heterosexual. Sexuality encompasses several potentially distinct dimensions of human behavior, attraction, and personal identity, as decades of research on human sexuality has shown. Do you agree that sexual orientation encompasses several dimensions of behavior, attraction, and identity?
Well, as I said earlier, the definition encompasses those three different dimensions.
Do you agree with the characterization in the sentence of several potentially distinct dimensions?
Well, there's certainly a difference between attraction and behavior, so in that sense, I guess so. You can, these are different sorts of dimensions.
All right, thank you. And later down on the page, again, 21, you'll see in the second sentence, Professor Badgett writes, one approach that I have used with data from the General Social Survey, Badgett 1995-2001, involves identifying...
Wait a minute, I'm sorry, I don't see that citation.
Okay, it's in the second sentence.
Oh, okay, I see. You're way down at the bottom, okay.
You see that?
Yes.
Thank you. One approach that I have used with data from the General Social Survey, Badgett 1995-2001, involves identifying LGBT people based on the relative lifetime frequency of same-sex sexual behavior. In other words, I classify a person as LGBT if he or she has had at least same-sex partners as different sex partners since the age of 18. Do you believe that's a reasonable way to classify individuals as LGB?
Well, Professor Badgett, if I understand this in the context in which it's done, in her studies, she was dealing with the question of how to draw some conclusions from national survey data that didn't actually ask people if they were gay or lesbian or bisexual or heterosexual. A bit earlier on the page, she refers to the Lauman study of the National Health and Social Life Survey, in which they found that although about 90% of the people in the sample were consistently heterosexual in their behavior and attractions and identity, and a core group of probably 1 to 2% of the sample were consistently lesbian, gay, or bisexual in their attractions, behavior, and identity, there were some individuals who were not consistent in those different ways. And so I believe that what Professor Badgett is doing here, and of course I've never seen this before, so this is the first I've seen it, but I would assume what she's trying to do is explain that in the absence of better measures which weren't available through this general social survey, better measures of sexual orientation, she chose to look at behavior as a proxy variable for sexual orientation, and I would assume that she's explaining the rationale for doing that.
And do you agree with her rationale?
I read it.
All right. Do you agree that depending on the data available, classifying a person as LGB if he or she has had at least as many same-sex partners as different sex partners since the age of 18 might be a reasonable approach?
Well, you know what we have to do as social scientists is we frequently end up having to make a variety of assumptions in operationalizing our variables. We frequently make a variety of assumptions when we operationalize our variables. And one of the rules that we live by is we explain the assumptions that we've made and we explain what we've done so that other social scientists can evaluate that. And so Professor Badgett, in looking at the survey data from the General Social Survey, ended up having to count as lesbian, gay, or bisexual individuals who reported having at least as much sexual contact with someone of the same sex as with someone of the other sex. Now, I would say that some researchers would suggest that that might not be an ideal approach to operationalizing lesbian, gay, or bisexual individuals. It's what she did, in this study. And I believe that in other studies there have been other approaches to operationalizing them. So what's important is that she's spelling out what she did and what assumptions she made, and so when we evaluate her data, we will know that and we will evaluate it with that information in mind.
Thank you. And you said you know Professor Badgett. Are you aware of her reputation as a scholar in her field?
Yes, I would say that Professor Badgett, to my knowledge, is well regarded in her field. In the area of studies related to sexual orientation, she is certainly well regarded. As a non-economist, I can't speak to how she's regarded amongst economists.
All right, thank you. I believe that's ample foundation. I can move this into evidence.
What are you moving into evidence?
I'm moving in the book.
The whole book?
Your Honor, we would like an opportunity to look at the book, so maybe we can have a chance to look at that.
Reserving that objection, but I will admit the portion that the witness was examined about.
Yes, Your Honor. If for some reason opposing counsel has an objection to the book as a whole, I would at least like to admit the chapter in the book that these pages are drawn from.
Your Honor, the chapter that we have been discussing was obviously the only one that Professor Herrera has made any statements about, so I don't know that there's anything else we can add to the rest of the book.
I certainly will admit the excerpt singular that is contained in tab 10 with respect to the whole chapter or the entire book. Let's reserve on that and see whether there's an objection. And if there is, I will rule on that.
All right. And in fact, I would like to modify my request to limit it to the chapter. I believe opposing counsel has made a reasonable point.
That's fine, Your Honor.
So there's no objection to admitting the chapter. Is that it, Mr. Dettmer?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize we don't even have the whole chapter here.
I believe that opposing counsel is requesting the opportunity to inspect the chapter and the actual physical copy of the book first.
That's what I understood, but it seems to change.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I was under the impression that we had the whole chapter here, and I understand now that we only have an excerpt of the chapter as opposed to...
There's only 2 pages. I will admit the 2 pages, 21 and the page...
Your Honor?
I guess it's 23 and 21. That's how I see it. It's pages 20 to 23. That will be admitted. We'll reserve on the entire chapter and give counsel an opportunity to review it, and then we will deal with that later.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. And again, I would like to, Professor Heyck, could you turn to tab 9 in the witness binder? And again, you will find selected pages from a book we have designated as DIX 950. And again, I have a physical copy of the book here that I can provide if you would like to inspect that. Are you familiar with this book, Professor Herrera?
Yes, I'm somewhat familiar with this book. I have read portions of it, I believe.
And in fact, if we look at, again, this is by Professor Badgett, correct?
I believe so, yes. You know, in my binder, it doesn't actually have a full...
The very first page, the cover of the book is reproduced?
It's black.
Oh, is that right? I apologize.
Yeah, I can see the title in white, and that's all.
All right. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah, only the subtitle was visible on this. Yes.
Could you read the title and the subtitle?
It's called Money, Myths, and Change, The Economic Lives of Lesbians and Gay Men, M.V. Lee Badgett.
All right, thank you. And if you could turn to the first page of the acknowledgments, it's reproduced in the binder.
Uh-huh.
And in the middle it says, over the years I have also been lucky to have received suggestions, ideas, and much support from, lists a number of names, including Greg Herrick. Do you believe she's referring to you, Professor Herrick?
I believe so.
Thank you. Okay, please look at page 4 in the book. And again, that's reproduced in the binder. And in the second full paragraph, you will see that it says, quote, defining the book's boundary around the sexual orientation of gay men and lesbians does not address exactly what gay or lesbian means, however. Does it mean someone who engages in same-sex sexual behavior, someone who fantasizes about such acts, someone who will identify himself or herself as gay or lesbian? Do you believe those are all reasonable ways to define gay or lesbian?
Well, I believe that earlier I said that we defined it in terms of attractions, behaviors, and identities, and I would say that those are the three dimensions that she's describing in these questions.
All right, thank you. And please turn to page 7. That's, again, also reproduced in the binder. And in the second full paragraph on that page, the first paragraph being the one that starts at the top and this being the next one, she says, all of these historical analyses suggest that what it means to be gay or lesbian in the United States in the 20th century has been shaped by a broad social context that includes economic development. Do you believe that what it means to be gay or lesbian in the United States today has been shaped by a broad social context that includes economic development?
I would say that everyone in the United States, that their understandings of themselves has been shaped by a broad social context that includes economic development.
Okay, thank you. And please turn to page 29. And again, that's reproduced. And the sentence that starts at the very bottom of the page and carries over the next the next page says, as mentioned in Chapter 1, the sexual orientation definition issue has provoked a heated theoretical debate about how to think about the meaning of sexual orientation and who we think of as being gay. Do you agree with that statement?
I'm sorry, where on page 29?
It's the very bottom, the sentence that starts about halfway in the last line and carries over on the next page, Your Honor.
Ah.
Well, I'm honestly not sure exactly what she means by heated theoretical debate. I know that there's certainly been a great deal of discussion and writing about different aspects of sexual orientation and concerns about defining it, for example, solely in behavioral terms or in other terms. But, you know, I'm afraid that without having the context of having read this book and having read it recently, it's possibly even that I have read some of this in the past, but I honestly don't recall. But it's difficult to comment on that sentence and know exactly what she meant by it.
Okay, thank you. And if I may make a brief aside, Your Honor, I've just received confirmation from my co-counsel that we, in fact, gave the plaintiffs the whole sexual orientation book, the one we were just talking about a moment ago, and we have an email confirming receipt of that. So they have been given that book, and I believe that's the case of this book as well. So now back to where we were, and apologize for that interjection, Professor Herrick. So do you believe Professor Badgett is mistaken when she says the sexual orientation definition issue has provoked a heated theoretical debate?
No. What I said was that I don't think I can comment on that without having read the context in which she discusses it.
You believe, depending on context, that might be a reasonable thing to say?
I have to read it.
So it might be unreasonable.
I really just can't comment on it without having read. I honestly don't know exactly what she's referring to. I think that Professor Badgett is a very reasonable person. She's a good scholar, but as far as commenting on that particular observation, I can't do it without having the context for it and knowing exactly what she was saying.
Well, leaving aside the context and Professor Badgett, just take the statement. The sexual orientation definition issue has provoked a heated theoretical debate. Do you believe that's an unreasonable statement?
Well, there are many heated theoretical debates in the social sciences, and some of them revolve around sexuality. Which particular heated theoretical debate she's referring to, I'm not certain, and whether I would also characterize it as heated might be a difference of opinion. But as I said, I don't know the context of what she's talking about. So if you could explain to me exactly what debate she's referring to and what it's, who are the writers on each side and what it is that they're saying, then perhaps I could comment on that.
All right, thank you. Please look at the next paragraph, and this is on page 30. And she talks about, in the second sentence, she says, the simplest way to categorize people would be to label as gay or lesbian those who have ever had a same-sex partner. Since bisexual people will also fall into that category using the behavioral measure, this analysis compares heterosexual people with gay, lesbian, or bisexual people. Unfortunately, the data allow no way to know whether having a same-sex partner was recent or frequent, obviously a disadvantage in identifying a characteristic thought to have some social and economic influence over a lifetime and career. Do you believe that that is a reasonable way to assess sexual orientation, to look at those who have ever had a same-sex partner?
I believe that what she's doing here is, again, talking about some specific research studies in which she analyzed data, perhaps from the general social surveys, as we were discussing in reference to the earlier passage, but I don't know the context of this. But I believe that what she's doing is talking about the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. So, as I was saying earlier, this is what researchers do, right? They explain the strengths and weaknesses of taking various approaches to operationalizing a variable.
Thank you. And depending on context, could that be a reasonable approach?
For purposes of the study she was conducting, it could, yes.
All right, thank you. Then she writes, continuing on, but a second categorization that might capture the usualness of same-sex partners is to compare the number of same-sex partners to the number of opposite-sex partners. If someone has had at least as many same-sex as opposite-sex partners, it seems unlikely that he or she would have a strictly heterosexual orientation. And do you agree that if someone has had at least as many same-sex as opposite-sex partners, it is unlikely that he or she would have a strictly heterosexual orientation?
Well, I believe that, for example, and again, keeping in mind, this is Professor Badgett talking about a way to analyze these survey data and just trying to come up with a proxy definition for what might constitute a lesbian, gay, or bisexual individual. I think it would probably depend upon the number of sexual partners they've had in each group. If a person reports having had one same-sex partner and one other sex partner throughout the course of their life, then it might be difficult to make a clear distinction, especially if you don't know which is their current partner and if one of those partners may have been in the far distant past. So it could be difficult, but I think with the sort of data that Professor Badgett is probably dealing with here, and again, I don't know the exact context in which she's making these statements, but in terms of the sorts of data sets that she's dealing with, that at least is a defensible strategy for trying to identify lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals in the data set, with the understanding that there probably will be some error there.
All right, and leaving aside the data set and the context, do you agree that if someone has had at least as many same-sex as opposite-sex partners, it is unlikely that he or she would have a strictly heterosexual orientation?
Well, first of all, I don't think you can leave aside the data. You know, the context here, because she is talking about methodology, I believe, in this passage, so that's what that's all about. Now, in terms of just knowing about an individual, I think that if you are speaking of actually being able to talk to the individual and ascertain information about them in a detailed way, you would want to know more than simply the number of sexual partners they've had, number of male sexual partners, number of female sexual partners. But that would be in a more ideal circumstance, which is most likely not the situation Professor Badgett was facing in trying to analyze the data from this large national survey.
All right, thank you. Let's continue on, because she does explain how the definitions work with the survey data, and she writes, the more complete set of options in the NHSLS allows a comparison of the two definitions to measures of self-identified sexual orientation for the 1992 survey respondents. Of the people who have had one or more same-sex partners, 46.3%, 50 individuals, classified themselves as heterosexual, suggesting a poor match between the simple classification by behavior and self-identity. Of the people in the NHSLS with at least as many same-sex as opposite-sex partners, however, only 15.7% considered themselves heterosexual, while 56.9% considered themselves homosexual, 11.8% called themselves bisexual, and 13.7% considered themselves something else. Have you seen those statistics before?
Well, I'm familiar with the National Health and Social Life Survey. This is a particular way of breaking out the data, and I'm generally familiar with the way the data came out in this study. This particular way of breaking it out, I think, is something Professor Badgett did, but I'm generally familiar with these data, with this study.
Thank you. And does her breakout of that data in any way alter your opinion regarding the definition of sexual orientation?
Does it alter my opinion about the general definition of sexual orientation as referring to attraction, behavior, or identity?
Correct.
Her discussion of these data doesn't affect my impression. As I said before, in these data, approximately 90% of the respondents in the survey were consistently heterosexual in their behavior, identity, and attraction. Another core group were consistently lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And what Professor Badgett seems to be talking about here are some of the people who weren't in those two groups where you see the consistency, but in fact perhaps had engaged in some instance of same-sex sexual behavior without identifying themselves as lesbian, gay, or bisexual.
All right, thank you. Now, please turn to page 47, and I want you to look at the first full sentence at the top of the page. It's in the carryover paragraph from the previous page. It says, sexual orientation is not an observable characteristic of an individual as sex and race usually are. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, as I said earlier, you typically cannot tell what a person's sexual orientation is just from looking at them. I would qualify that as well by saying that sometimes you can't tell what a person's race or ethnicity is simply by looking at them either. But certainly it's the case with sexual orientation that simply looking at a person typically does not reveal what their sexual orientation is.
All right, so do you agree with that statement or not, or just can't without that qualification?
As I just said.
Okay, thank you. And Your Honor, I would like to admit this, and I would like to admit Exhibit DIX 950, which is the book Money, Myths, and Change into Evidence.
Your Honor, I don't believe that Professor Herrera has laid any foundation for this book. He said he hasn't read it, maybe ever. He's not sure if he has read these particular portions. And I do note that Professor Badgett, I believe, was on the stand earlier in this trial. I just don't think there's any foundation for it.
I will certainly admit the excerpts that he's questioned him about. That apparently is what you're interested in.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Your Honor.
Tell me, when would it be convenient for you to move on to another subject?
Okay, Your Honor, this is actually very important to our theory of the case, the definition of sexual orientation, so I do intend to continue to question the witness.
That's fine.
Thank you.
But tell me when it would be a good time to take a break.
Oh, I'd be happy to take a break whenever the court, it's in the court's convenience.
Why don't we do it now then?
All right, thank you.
How long a break do you usually take?
Can we resume in 15 minutes? Very well. Mr. Nielsen, you may continue your examination of the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. And before I do that, I do want to mention that we have an email confirming receipt of the sexual orientation employment book that is at tab 10 from counsel. And with respect to the Money, Myths, and Change book at tab 9, they designated that book on their exhibit list too, so they plainly had it and are aware of it.
Mr. Dettmer?
Your Honor, the only response that I have is that I don't believe Professor Heyck has really laid a foundation for the admission of those documents, and Professor Badgett was here, and obviously that was an ideal opportunity to question her about those books.
Well, tell me, is there an objection to the admission of these exhibits?
On that same basis, Your Honor, we do object to the admission of these two books.
Lack of foundation?
Well, lack of foundation by this witness, and also the opportunity with the actual author of the books to put the books into evidence.
What do you need from the books, Mr. Nielsen, that is not contained in these excerpts?
The main thing I'm interested in are the things that are contained in the excerpts.
What's that?
Mainly, I'm interested in the excerpts, Your Honor.
Then why don't we simply admit the excerpts?
All right. To clarify, Your Honor, so the excerpts are in.
Yes?
Okay, thank you. All right. Professor Herrera, could you please turn to tab 11 in the witness binder, and you'll find a document pre-marked DIX 1108. Can you identify that document?
The title of it is Best Practices for Asking Questions About Sexual Orientation on Surveys.
Thank you. And, Your Honor, this has been admitted, and we did cross-examine Professor Badgett about it, so I won't spend much time on it. But I do want to ask you one question about it, Professor Herrick. Please turn to page 28. And under measurement, there is a heading that you will see that says measurement.
Yes.
It says, differences in relationships and sexual practices around the world call into question the cross-cultural equivalence of sexual orientation as a social construct, independent of how the construct is operationalized or how well items intended to measure the construct have been linguistically translated. Do you agree with that observation?
Well, I would say that that is generally an accurate observation about most constructs that we ask about in survey research. You always want to be aware that there are cultural differences in how different concepts and different terms are understood, apart from simply the language, differences in language, but the meaning behind the terms as well. And so that certainly fits well with the construct of sexual orientation as well as many others.
But you specifically agree that it fits well with the concept of sexual orientation?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You used the term operationalized, and I see that that term is used in the excerpt that you just read. What does it mean in lay terms?
Well, Your Honor, when we approach a research project, we think in terms of variables, phenomena that somehow can change, and we usually start with a theoretical definition of the variable, the ideal definition, sort of the definition you'd see in a dictionary. But then comes the hard part, which is how you actually measure that variable. How do you put it into operational terms? So one might have a general definition for what socioeconomic status means in a textbook sense, but when you actually get to the survey question, you can't say, what's your socioeconomic status? You have to figure out a way to ask the question of the individuals. For example, what was your household income during the last year? And then that answer is used as the operational definition of socioeconomic status for that study. So when we operationalize something, it means that we are putting it into measurable terms, and we are defining how we are going to measure it in a particular study.
Would it be fair to characterize that as a proxy for some variable?
Yes, because the idea would be that you are always going to be missing something from the theoretical definition. At least maybe I could come up with an example where you didn't, but typically, yeah, it is going to be a proxy for the theoretical variable. And of course, some operationalizations are better than others, meaning they get closer to that theoretical definition.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Professor Herrick, could you please turn to page 12 in the witness binder, or tab 12, excuse me. And you will see a document pre-marked DIX 1249. Can you identify this document?
This is a paper called Sampling Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Populations, published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology in 2009, authored by Ilan Meyer and Patrick Wilson.
Thank you. And, Your Honor, I believe this document has already been admitted into evidence. Are you familiar with this document?
I'm reasonably certain I've read this paper. I haven't read it recently, but I'm pretty sure I read it.
And you're familiar with Professor Meyer, of course, correct?
I'm familiar with Professor Meyer and his work, yes.
And he is one of the plaintiff's experts in this case, correct?
I believe so.
All right, thank you. On page 24, and I'm using the internal pagination of the article, there is the first full paragraph starting with the second sentence. It reads, researchers have distinguished among sexual identity, sexual behavior, and attraction, and we've discussed that. And going on, although these overlap, That is, a person who is attracted to same-sex individuals may also have sex with same-sex individuals. This overlap is not great. Only among 15% of women and 24% of men do the three categories overlap. Have you seen those statistics before?
Well, those statistics are drawn from the Lauman study that I was describing earlier, and as I said, what they found was that there was a core group, and it was typically the people who said that they were lesbian or gay or bisexual for whom these three categories did overlap substantially. However, there were many individuals who said, well, they were categorized as having some sort of same-sex attraction, and that was based either on their response to a question about whether they were physically or sexually attracted to people of the same sex, or if they even said that they found the idea of sex with another person of the same sex at least somewhat appealing, that they were put into that category of having some same-sex desire. And those individuals, it turns out, were among the largest group in this minority that wasn't heterosexual and wasn't exclusively lesbian, gay, or bisexual. It was those individuals who said they had the some attraction or found this idea somewhat appealing. And then there were other individuals who said that they engaged in behavior with someone of the same sex but were not themselves lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and in some cases didn't even say that they had attraction. So that's where these numbers come from.
So you are familiar with the numbers?
Yes.
And do you believe Professor Meyer accurately portrayed them here?
Well, you know, I always have trouble remembering the specific percentages, but I'm certainly willing to assume that he has stated them accurately here.
All right, thank you. Now, continuing on, it reads, even within these categories, varied groups can be identified. Identity labels, and even whether a person uses an LGB identity label at all, vary across generations, racial ethnic groups, geographical regions, education levels, and other group characteristics. Do you agree that identity labels for sexual orientation vary in this manner?
You know, I'm honestly not sure exactly what he means when he says identity labels vary. I am aware in the parenthetical clause there that says even whether a person uses an LGB identity label at all, that we certainly have seen differences rather there across racial and ethnic groups. For example, in my one of the studies I was talking about earlier, which showed that 95% of gay men said they don't experience a choice about their sexual orientation. That study was based on a nationally representative sample of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults. And one of the patterns that I observed in those data was that the category of bisexual men, self-described bisexual men, was much more likely to include Hispanics and non-Hispanic blacks than were the categories of gay men, lesbian, or bisexual women. So we certainly do see variations across racial and ethnic groups. I'm not exactly certain how you interpret the statement without that parenthetical clause to just say identity labels vary, unless, of course, he means something along the lines of what I was referring to earlier, and he says across generations, and maybe what he means there is, for example, that use of a word like queer as a self-descriptor, as it's much more common among younger individuals than among older individuals. I'm honestly, though, I'm not quite sure about the reference to geographical regions and other group characteristics. So I would assume, and again, I haven't read this paper recently. Perhaps he lays that out in greater detail at another point in the paper, but I'm not honestly sure, just taking this sentence out of context, exactly what he means by that.
All right, thank you. Now continuing on, Professor Meyer states, behavioral definitions which rely on seemingly objective and clear criteria, often asked as, have you had sexual relationships with men, women, or both men and women, also vary. For example, researchers have referred to different time periods for assessing sexuality, past year, past 5 years, since age 18, and ever. Because more people have had same-sex sex in adolescence, defining sexual orientation as sexual behavior ever includes more people than defining it as past year. This can lead to significantly different estimates. Lauman et al. Found that 42% of all men who had ever had sex contact had none after age 18. Do you agree that behavioral definitions of sexual orientation can vary in this manner?
I teach a course on survey and questionnaire methodology, and this is something I always explain to my students, that whenever you are asking about past behaviors, you absolutely have to specify the time period in which you are asking about. And any behavior that is something that might be repeated is going to be more likely to have occurred in, if you, I'm sorry, if you specify a broader range of time, you're going to get a higher level of that behavior. So if you ask people, have you done such and such in the past year, and you also ask them, have you done such and such in the past 20 years, or how often, you are likely to get a higher number if you ask about 20 years than if you ask about 1 year.
Okay, thank you. Now, please turn to tab 13 in the witness binder, if you would, sir. And you will find the document pre-marked DIX 1248. And I apologize, Professor Herrich, the exhibit appears to be missing its title page, but I'll represent to you that this is a copy of an article entitled Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Health Findings and Concerns, written by a group of scholars including Laura Dean, Ilan Meyer, and published in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Medical Association in 2000. And, Your Honor, this is DIX 1248 has already been admitted, but are you familiar with this article?
I'm honestly not sure if I've seen this article before.
Are you familiar with Laura Dean?
I know Laura Dean, and I know some of her research.
All right, thank you. And you're familiar with Professor Miller, correct?
Professor who?
Meyer.
Meyer, yes.
Thank you. All right, please look at page 102. In the second paragraph, the second sentence reads, the degree to which sexual orientation or gender identity is central to one's self-definition, the level of affiliation with other LGBT people, and the rejection or acceptance of societal stereotypes and prejudice vary greatly among individuals. Do you agree that the degree to which sexual orientation is central to one's self-definition varies greatly among individuals?
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to catch up with you here.
The question is, do you agree that the degree to which sexual orientation is central to one's self-definition varies greatly amongst individuals?
I would say that, yes, in the context of this sentence, in the same way that rejection or acceptance of stereotypes and prejudices also varies greatly. I would say that all of those things do show variability from one individual to another.
All right, and on the same page underneath, the next heading, it says, lesbian, gay, and bisexual LGBT people are defined by their sexual orientation.
I'm sorry, where are we?
It's the same page, same column. It's under lesbian, gay, and bisexual population, that next paragraph.
Okay, thank you.
You see that?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual LGBT people are defined by their sexual orientation, a definition that is complex and variable. Throughout history and among cultures, the definition of sexual orientation shifts and changes. Do you agree that the definition of sexual orientation is complex and variable?
Well, I think we've been discussing the fact that it's complex and variable here. I think is making the point that I made earlier, that, for example, it seemed as though the emergence of some of the categories of homosexual and heterosexual are evident in the medical literature only since the 19th century. So I assume that that's what they're meaning when they say throughout history and among cultures, the definition of sexual orientation shifts and changes.
All right, thank you. And do you agree that throughout history and among cultures, the definition does shift and change?
I would say that it has changed.
Has shifted, has changed?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt. Just as a matter of completeness, the quotation does go on to say that, quote, while sexual orientation is not easily defined, the generally accepted definition of an LGBT person is one with an orientation toward people of the same gender and sexual behavior, affection, or attraction, and or self-identity as a gay, lesbian, or bisexual, end quote. Just as a matter of completeness, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I believe that comments of that sort would be better reserved for redirect.
I agree.
All right. Please turn to page 135.
Page, I'm sorry?
135. Sorry, again, I'm using the internal pagination of the article. And I'm going to start with the second sentence in the paragraph under defining the populations. Do you see that, Professor Herrich?
Yes.
It says, in fact, many different terms were used to label sexual orientations before the terms heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, gay, and lesbian solely came into widespread use from the 1920s through the 1960s. Do you agree with that?
That there were different terms? Well, yes, I think actually when they say widespread use, I assume that they mean in common parlance. The term homosexual the term homosexual, I believe, started to appear in medical literature in the late 1800s, and heterosexual followed soon after that. Gay and lesbian as terms to describe lesbians and gay men are more recent and have become popular in the general culture, I think, really since the 1960s. So, and prior to that, there were other terms that were used to describe these phenomena of sexual orientation.
All right, thank you. And they go on to write, the authors go on to write in the next sentence, unfortunately, there is still no general consensus on the definition of these terms, although each includes components of at least one of three dimensions. 1, sexual orientation identity. 2, sexual behavior. And/or 3, sexual attraction. Now, we've discussed those three dimensions, but do you agree with Professor Meyer and Professor Dean's statement that there is, quote, still no general consensus, close quote, on the meaning of those terms, which would include homosexual, gay, and lesbian?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what they mean by consensus, but I think that what they're getting at is that these terms are used in different ways depending upon the, and we are talking about researchers here, depending upon the study. So, for example, well, in fact, you know, continuing the paragraph here, they say, for example, one study might define sexual orientation as a form of identity as self-identified heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian, while another defines it as a gender choice in sexual partners, and yet another as the gender of those to whom one is sexually attracted. So what they are saying is some studies might define it in terms of identity, some in terms of attraction, some in terms of behavior. In that sense, you know, as I think we've been saying, researchers end up using different operational definitions of the term depending upon their research needs and depending sometimes on the data set. So I don't know that I would phrase it as saying there is no consensus. I think there is consensus that these are the different ways that we use these terms. It's just that depending upon the research needs, you sometimes define it one way, say in terms of behavior, other times you define it in terms of identification, other times in terms of the pattern of attraction.
Well, now, do you believe that, well, now you said you wouldn't say it that way, but do you believe that the statement, there is still no general consensus on the definition of these terms, is an unreasonable statement?
Well, if by consensus they mean that there is no single definition that is always used by all researchers, if that's what they mean by no consensus, then I would agree with that. I would say if what, you know, if we are interpreting that to mean that there is no agreement that these three dimensions are the main ones of sexual orientation, then I would disagree with that. This, of course, makes me tend to think that what they mean is that people use these terms in different ways depending upon the research context, rather than having one single definition that is always used throughout all research studies.
So you believe that if they used it in the second sense, that would be unreasonable?
Well, I think I just said that.
You said you disagreed with it. I'm asking whether you think that would be unreasonable.
Well, but by the second, I may be forgetting which was the second sense. I thought that the idea that different researchers define it differently depending upon the study, and if that's what they mean by there not being consensus, then of course that's accurate.
But the other one you said, if they mean it
that there's a single definition that is used uniformly by all researchers in every situation, and that's how the term is, that's how the construct is always operationalized. I would say there is not that sort of consensus.
And you believe that if they use the term more broadly, just to mean that there is no general consensus, without the qualifications you gave, that it would be an unreasonable statement?
Well, I've got to admit I'm a little bit lost. I think it would be a reasonable statement to say that there is no one definition that is always used consistently in every research study by every researcher. And so if that's the meaning of there is no consensus, then I would agree with that and say that that's an accurate statement. If they mean, and I think this is probably not what they mean to say that, well, I'm sorry, now I'm getting a little lost myself. As I've been saying, the term is defined differently in different research studies depending upon the operational meanings of the study. And if that's what they mean by there being, well, I don't think that's what they meant, but I can't imagine that that's what they were thinking of.
All right, let's move on to the next. Let's skip a paragraph. The paragraph that starts, recent national studies. We're still on the same page. And it says, recent national studies estimating the percentage of the population that falls into each of the three broad dimensions of identity, behavior, and attraction show that 1 to 4% of the population identifies as lesbian or gay, 2 to 6% of the policies reports some same-sex behavior in the previous 5 years, and up to 21% of the population reports same-sex attraction at least once in adulthood. And then there's a series of citations. Therefore, depending upon how it is defined and measured, 1 to 21% of the population could be classified as lesbian or gay to some degree, with the remainder classified as bisexual or heterosexual to some degree. Are you familiar with those statistics, Professor Herrera?
Yeah, I think I'm generally familiar with the studies that they're citing here. Yeah, I haven't reviewed most of them lately, but I think I'm familiar with these studies.
But you believe those statistics are fully consistent with the opinions that you've offered in this case, correct?
Yes. That, in fact, what we see is that if you simply ask about same-sex attraction or simply the idea that someone might find an interaction, sexual interaction with someone of the same sex, at least somewhat appealing, you do get a very broad, you get a large number of people saying that, who would not necessarily also say that they have engaged in same-sex behavior or identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. So, yes, I would say that those numbers probably are accurate.
All right, thank you. And please turn to the next page, 136. I want you to look at that page. The authors have switched, as you'll see looking at the back page, from defining the populations to measuring the populations.
Yes.
And they say, existing measures of sexual orientation range in complexity from simple dichotomous measures in which subjects report that they are or are not heterosexual or homosexual to more complex scales as developed by Kinsey. And I'll skip the apparatus. Klein, Shively, DeCecco, and Sell. There exists no consensus and virtually no literature discussing when, where each of those members should be used. Do you agree that existing measures of sexual orientation vary in this manner?
Well, it only makes sense, that if you are defining sexual orientation in terms of attraction, are you going to measure it differently than if you define it in terms of one's sexual behavior history? So, yes, it's the case that there are a variety of different measures, and I believe that actually the document that you that we were looking at earlier, the one about the best practices, contained recommendations for survey researchers on the best way to ask questions about those different facets of sexual orientation.
Yes, I believe that's correct. And now it says, there exists no consensus and virtually no literature discussing when and where each of these measures should be used. Do you agree with that?
Well, there's that word consensus again, and I'm not sure what they mean by that. I would say that there certainly is variability in how researchers have measured sexual orientation, and that a study might very well be criticized on the ground that the measure of sexual orientation that they used was not the best one for the purpose of their research study. And so, in that sense, I guess you can say that there would not be consensus on when and where each of these measures should be used. And I would say also that I don't know that there is virtually no research literature, but there certainly has not been an extensive research literature on the various strategies, specifically discussing the various strategies all in comparison with each other. Certainly, these different references that they are citing are all instances where researchers were developing ways of measuring sexual orientation. And if we go back to that earlier paragraph where they were citing the national studies that came up with these different percentages, certainly all of those researchers discussed at some point how they measured sexual orientation. So I think what they must be referring to is literature that somehow is putting all of these different measures side by side and comparing them. And perhaps there is not an extensive literature in that regard, although I do believe that Dr. Sell, who is cited here, he has published several papers on that topic.
All right, thank you. Please turn to tab 14 in the witness binder, and you'll find the document pre-marked DIX 1235. Can you identify this document?
This is an article Letitia Ann Peplau and Linda Garnett's titled A New Paradigm for Understanding Women's Sexuality and Sexual Orientation, which was published in the Journal of Social Issues in 2000.
Thank you. Are you familiar with this article?
Yes.
And you're familiar with Professor Peplau, correct?
Yes.
And she is one of the plaintiff's experts in this case, correct?
That's my understanding.
Yes, thank you. Your Honor, I would like to offer Exhibit DIX 1235 into evidence.
Your Honor, again, we would just object to the extent that Professor Peplau was here to answer questions about this article when she was on the stand, and offering it now, we missed the opportunity for her to talk about that.
Well, let's see where this goes. I think probably you have some questions about some of the comments.
I do.
So why don't we just admit the letter or the article?
Thank you. The reason we are using these documents with Professor Herrera rather than Professor Peplau is that they go to the topics of his testimony.
Well, it doesn't pose quite the same problem as admitting whole books.
All right, thank you. Please turn to page 342, if you would, Professor Herrick, and you will see a table, Table 1. The table is entitled Comparing Old and New Paradigms for Conceptualizing Women's Sexual Orientation. And on the one side, you will see old perspectives. On the new side, rather on the right side, you will see new perspectives. And the second one from the bottom, the authors, you will see that the authors label it as the old perspectives, or the old perspective. Sexual identity, attractions, and behavior form discrete categories, i.e. heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual. And then as the new perspective, sexual identity, attractions, and behavior can be varied, complex, and inconsistent. Do you agree with the new perspective, Professor Herrick?
Well, what Professor Peplau is doing here is pointing out that just as the old perspective was that homosexuals are abnormal and psychologically impaired and gender nonconforming, that's really something we know is no longer the case. And I think that what she's pointing out here is that data, such as that from the Lauman study and others, show that, in fact, there are individuals, even though they may be a relative minority of individuals, there are individuals for whom their behavioral histories, their attractions, and their identities don't match up perfectly.
All right, thank you. And if could you please turn back to page 337? And in the third paragraph on that page, she writes, in the middle of the paragraph, more broadly, the phenomena of sexual orientation are not fixed and universal, but rather highly variable across time and place. Do you agree with that statement, Professor Herrick?
Well, in the context in which she is saying it, which is pointing to cross-cultural and historical studies, meaning that if we are looking at all human beings throughout all time, it would be a mistake to say that the experience of contemporary women are universal, that they apply to all women in all historical areas and across all cultures. And so certainly, and I would, although this article focuses on women, I would say the same is true of men's experiences, that you cannot generalize across all cultures and all historical eras from our experience in contemporary American society. And I believe that that's what she says in this sentence here.
All right, and please turn to page 344. And you'll see a heading titled Multiple Pathways when you get there. Do you see that, Professor Herrick?
Yes.
Okay, and the paragraph under that, the last full sentence on that page that starts in contemporary. In contemporary society, a woman's assertion that she is heterosexual or lesbian may be based on quite diverse and nonlinear developmental trajectories. Women may be drawn to a particular lifestyle for differing reasons. Knowing that a woman labels herself as heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual does not necessarily inform us about the pattern of her life experiences or the nature of her current erotic thoughts and feelings. Do you disagree with any of those statements?
Well, I think that what Professor Peplau and Dr. Ganetz are talking about here is the idea that it has often been assumed by people who try to understand the etiology or the origins of sexual orientation that there's simply going to be a single explanation that's going to apply to everyone. And I believe that what she's suggesting here is that, in fact, it's more likely to be the case that people arrive at their adult sexual orientation through different pathways. And so simply because you know that a particular woman is heterosexual doesn't necessarily tell you what her developmental history was, any more than knowing that she is a lesbian or bisexual, that there may be, in fact, a variety of different experiences and perhaps even biological factors that work differently in different individuals. And so there's no single pathway to adult sexual orientation. It may very well be the case that there are multiple pathways.
All right, thank you. And what about the last part, where she says, knowing that a woman labels herself as heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual does not necessarily inform us about the pattern of her life experiences or the nature of her current erotic thoughts and feelings. And what you just said, I think, focuses more on the pattern of her life experiences, perhaps, but what about the last part? Do you agree that knowing that a woman labels herself as heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual does not necessarily inform us of the nature of her current erotic thoughts and feelings?
Well, again, you know, using the example of the Lauman study, what we see there is that although most people who label themselves heterosexual also describe different sex attractions or said they had different sex attractions. And most people who label themselves lesbian, gay, or bisexual said that they had same-sex attractions. There were some people for whom that was not the case. So there were some people who labeled themselves heterosexual and yet said that they had some same-sex attractions. And so I believe that that's the sort of point that she is making here, that you can't assume that because one identifies with a particular label, that that necessarily tells you everything about their sexual attractions or their sexual behavior or experience. So we know that it does not in most cases, but not in every case.
Do you agree with her statement then?
I agree with what I just said, and I think that
Do you agree that knowing that a woman labels herself as heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual does not necessarily inform us of the nature of her current erotic thoughts and feelings?
Well, yeah, in the context of what I just said, I would say it does not necessarily inform us about her current attractions and behaviors as well.
All right, thank you. Now, Your Honor, I think we've laid more than ample foundation for this, and I would like to move this exhibit into evidence.
That's DIX 1235.
That's correct.
Very well.
Please turn to tab 15 in the witness binder, if you would, Professor Herrich. And you will find here a document pre-marked DIX 1239. And Professor Herrich, can you identify this document?
Well, I can identify the title. I'm not sure exactly where it's from. It's called The Development of Sexual Orientation in Women. The authors are Letitia Ann Peplau, Leah Spalding, Terry Conley, and Rosemary Veniegas. I believe this was published in an edited volume, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. It's not marked on the exhibit.
All right, thank you. And are you familiar with this document?
Well, I believe that I have read it. I haven't. I know I haven't read it recently, but I believe I have read it at some point in the past. Can you tell me where it's from? That would actually help refresh my memory.
I'm not certain at the moment as I stand here without double checking.
Is it from a journal or is it an edited book? Do you know?
I believe the answer to that question is yes. But if you're asking me which, I don't know.
Yeah, I meant which.
Which one?
Now,
I don't want to sustain a compound question objection.
you know exactly.
I wasn't going to object to my witness's question.
Yes, and I don't think I'm allowed to object to his questions. All right, so plaintiffs have indicated that they don't have an objection to the authenticity of this. And you are familiar with respect, Professor Peplau, correct?
Correct.
And you believe you are familiar with this work?
I believe I have seen it before, yes.
Okay, please turn to page 83, if you would.
Okay.
And the author writes, yet there, well, in the middle of, in page 83, it's around the middle of the page. The first sentence under the paragraph, second paragraph under the heading there.
Yeah, yes.
It says, yet there is ample documentation that same-sex attractions and behaviors are not inevitably or inherently linked to one's identity. Do you agree that same-sex attractions and behaviors are not inevitably linked to one's identity?
Well, I think that what they say in the next sentence there is the example of romantic friendships between women in the 18th and 19th centuries that were considered to be socially acceptable, but did not have an implication for a woman being identified as a lesbian or a homosexual. So certainly in that context, I think that that's an accurate statement.
What about genderly? Do you believe that there is ample documentation that same-sex attractions and behaviors are not inevitably linked to one's identity?
Well, without the benefit of reading the entire article again to know the exact contents, I would say that I have already said that in some cases, a person's attractions don't match their identity label. Sometimes a person's behaviors don't match their identity label. I do think, just from being able to scan this, I think they are specifically talking about historical research, but certainly would go back to what I already said about the idea that sometimes there are individuals whose identity label is not completely predictive of their behavior or some of their attractions.
So you shouldn't have. So you don't agree. So you do agree that there is no inevitable link, I gather. But what about the second half, though, and that there is no inherent link? Do you agree with that?
Well, could you? I'm honestly not sure what they mean by an inherent link, so I would have a problem with that. I'll go back to how I said it before without using the word inherent, because I'm honestly not quite sure what they mean here by that. It is the case that for most people there is a relationship, a close relationship, but for some people there is not. And so if that means there's not an inherent one because there are exceptions, then I would agree with that term, if that's what they meant by it.
What you think stated broadly, if someone were to state more generally that same-sex attractions and behaviors are not inherently linked to one's identity, do you believe that would be an unreasonable statement?
Well, I would just want to know what they meant by inherently.
And depending on their meaning, do you think that might be an unreasonable statement?
I would just want to know what they meant by inherently. As I said, I think if you are a betting person and a person tells you that they are heterosexual, the safe bet would be that their attractions are to people of the other sex. But it is possible that they might say they have same-sex attractions as well as, or even more. But so if what we mean by inherent is that there is absolutely no overlap, there is never a heterosexual person who, in order for it to be inherent, it would have to be the case that all heterosexuals report exclusively different sex attractions and exclusively different sex behavior. And the flip side of that, for lesbians and gay men, then I would say that no, you wouldn't say that there is an inherent link between those two things.
All right, thank you. And, Your Honor, I would like to move DAX 1239 into evidence.
Your Honor, we just renew the same objection about the author not being here, but understanding Your Honor's position.
I understand 1239 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Take me to the page that you were quoting in 1239.
Yes, Your Honor.
85.
It was page 87 that we were quoting from, Your Honor.
No, actually, it was page 83.
Did I misspeak?
I was looking at page 83.
All right, give me just a moment. It is page 83, Your Honor. I did misspeak there. And thank you, Professor Herrera, for catching that.
Beginning at what point?
It was the middle of the page, the second full paragraph on the page, Your Honor.
In America Today?
No, the next one below that. Yet there.
I see, right, fine.
All right, thank you. Professor Herrera, could you please turn to tab 16 in your witness binder, and you'll find a document pre-marked DIX 978. And can you identify this document, Professor Herrera?
It's a photocopy of the cover of the book describing the Lauman study that we've been referring to. The title of the book was The Social Organization of Sexuality, subtitle, Sexual Practices in the United States. And paging ahead, it looks as though it's Chapter 8 from that book, which was the chapter on homosexuality.
Correct. And in Chapter 8 is produced in full here. And I believe, Your Honor, that this Exhibit 978, DIX 978, is already in evidence?
I believe that's correct.
Your Honor, it's P943 as well.
It is. I believe that's correct. This is one that both sides designated, and honestly, I don't know which one it came in as.
If it's in, it's in.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, are you familiar with this? You are familiar with this document, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you relied on it in forming your expert opinions, correct?
Well, I relied on some of the data from this.
Yes, and in fact, you cited it in your report.
Yes.
And this study, the Lohman study, if I may call it that, it's widely considered to be a very high-quality national survey with a large probability sample of sexuality, correct?
Yes, I was only hesitating over large because I'm forgetting exact sample size, but it was a it is a respected national survey on sexuality.
Right. And do you believe that it was not a large probability sample?
Well, large, it's a relative term. I was just trying to remember I'm remembering that it was somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple thousand people, or maybe 3,200 people, something like that. And yeah, that's a good size sample.
All right, thank you. And in fact, no national study in the United States with a large probability sample has addressed questions of sexuality in the way that the Lohman study did. It was a very comprehensive survey and is still considered the authoritative source for data at this point, correct?
I believe I wrote those words.
You said them in your deposition, sir.
Yes, that's correct.